Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Chartered Accountants Ireland Ulster Economic Outlook for 2022. My name is Mark Lother and I'll be your host today. 2 years on from the start of the global pandemic, we continue to live in interesting times. Geopolitical pressures, EU exit, and local politics all combine to provide an uncertain outlook. What do we know about the economic outlook for Northern Ireland, and what can we expect in the year ahead? Well, here to help us try to answer these questions are our expert panel. I'm pleased to welcome back to our annual webcast Conor Lambe, Chief Economist from Danske Bank, and Gareth Hetherington, Director from Ulster University's Economic Policy Centre, both whom have helped us navigate the last 2 years in these webinars. I want to take this chance to congratulate Neil Gibson on his appointment at DFI, and his contribution to these webinars over the last 2 years has been great. Stepping into his shoes today, I'm grateful to Andrew Webb, the Chief Economist at Grant Thornton. So we're recording this session today and a link will be sent to you afterwards. If you'd like to put any questions to the panelists, please feel free to add those into the Q&A box and I will put them to them as we go through. So I'm going to kick off with Conor. You recently released your Northern Ireland quarterly sectoral forecast, and I note that the growth forecast for Northern Ireland economy has been downgraded. Perhaps you can give us some insight into your projections.
Hi, Mark. Yes, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all again and speaking to you. Yes, and that we've recently published our latest Northern Ireland quarterly sectoral forecast, and as you say, we've downgraded our expectations for economic growth this year. At the end of last year, we were forecasting growth of around 4% in 2022 for Northern Ireland. Our headline projection is now 3.6%. Now, in historical context, this would still be a very strong rate of economic growth, but we need to remember that this is still coming off the back of the recovery from the economic impacts of the pandemic. So there's still an element of catch up within those numbers, which is perhaps why they still feel quite strong relative to what we would have been talking about prior to 2020. But in terms of what's driven us to downgrade our projections, there are a number of key factors which we expect to impact the performance of the economy. There are 6 in total. I'll touch briefly on each of them. In terms of the factors which we think will weigh on economic activity, the first is the impact of high inflation on consumer spending power. Inflation in the UK is now at a 30-year high, and this sharp rate of price rises has been driven by a number of factors. We've seen higher fuel and energy costs. We've seen continued supply chain disruption impacting the prices of goods globally. And the war in Ukraine is also likely to keep upward pressure on both food and energy prices. Overall, for this year, we expect inflation to average about 7.2%, so more than 3 times higher than the Bank of England's 2% target. And I think it's important to note that when inflation is that high, if wage growth doesn't keep up with it, which we don't think it will, then we get what economists call real wages effectively falling. So people see their purchasing power eroded. Consumer spending is the biggest driver of the UK and Northern Ireland economic activity. It makes up over 60% of UK GDP. So when there's that squeeze on consumer spending, it does feed through into the wider economy. We're also seeing changes to government economic policy. So the big amount of fiscal support that we've seen over the last few years has started to be withdrawn, and we've also seen changes to, for example, the temporary 1.25 percentage point increase in national insurance for this year, which will become a health and social care levy from next year. Most of the income tax allowances and thresholds have been frozen. We have a planned increase in corporation tax next year as well. So while the Chancellor did announce some things like the change in the national insurance threshold in his spring statement, fiscal policy is becoming less accommodative than it was previously. We're also seeing changes to monetary policy. The Bank of England have increased interest rates a couple of times over the last few months in response to the high rates of inflation that we're seeing. And it's expected that we'll see further interest rate rises given that pace of inflation. So both fiscal and monetary policy becoming less accommodative and less supportive for households and businesses. And firms are still working through and dealing with the enhanced trade processes brought about by the UK's exit from the European Union, and we still have the uncertainty around the long-term implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and all those factors are likely to weigh on the economy. In terms of a couple of factors that might support economic activity, most labour market indicators in Northern Ireland remain relatively positive. And so at a time whenever high inflation is weighing down on consumer spending, the fact that there's a relatively large number of people in work might give it some support at the overall level. And we also think there'll be some continued recovery in business investment. At a UK-wide level, business investment is still quite a bit behind its pre-COVID levels, whereas wider GDP and consumer spending are further on in their recovery. This is sort of mirroring what we saw after the financial crisis in the UK, where it took business investment much longer to recover. Some firms were able to build up cash during the pandemic, and given that there is still that gap between current business investment levels and pre-pandemic levels, there's a bit more scope for catch up. We have the likes of the super deduction tax incentive as well. So we're hopeful it will see a bit of business investment fueling economic activity in there too.
Thanks for that, Conor. You also recently noted consumer confidence in Northern Ireland decreasing towards the end of 2021. How do you see that changing for 2022?
Yes, so our most recent Danske Bank Northern Ireland Consumer Confidence Index was for the last quarter of 2021. And as you note in there, Mark, we did see a fall in it. In terms of the factors that were driving the drop in consumer confidence, there were a few. The post-Brexit trading arrangements in Northern Ireland continued to weigh on consumer sentiment, but we also saw a higher proportion of people pointing to the impact of higher prices on their household budgets as having a negative impact on confidence. So in the end of last year, there were about 24% of the people who did our survey said that was the factor that had the largest negative impact on them. In Q3, it was 18%, so we saw quite an increase there. And of course, inflation has gone even higher as we've gone into the early part of 2022 than it was at the end of last year. We haven't yet published our Q1 report, but in the UK, there's a monthly consumer confidence index published by GfK. And for April, the figure there has dropped quite sharply. It's measured a slightly different way to our Northern Ireland measure, but the high inflation is very much coming through there as a big factor weighing down on confidence. And as I've said, with inflation having gone even higher, with changes to monetary policy, interest rates going up, fiscal policy not as supportive, lots of uncertainty still in the economy. You know, we still have the impacts of COVID. We have the war in Ukraine. There's a lot of uncertainty about the wider economic outlook. So I think it's probably fair to say that from a consumer perspective, it's quite challenging, and that will likely be reflected in consumer confidence indices, I would have thought, across most advanced economies as we go through this year.
Thank you very much for that, Conor. So now moving on to Andrew, I wanted to get your take on the economy. And I know you've become less optimistic about growth prospects this year, even fearing a recession could come. Can you expand on that for us?
I can indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. I suppose where I come from on this is the context Conor has set out. You know, there's a great context there in terms of where the economy was probably Q1. We're moving at such a fast pace at the minute that there's a lot of new information coming on a daily basis about really where consumer sentiment is and where business sentiment is. And that's all starting to point in a much more negative direction for us. So, I mean, what really struck me recently, and I had to read it twice when I read it, was that people are leaving food on shelves in food banks because they can't afford the energy to prepare that food. And that I felt was just such a stark image of where this economy is heading. And obviously that's, you know, we were coming out of the pandemic and there was a splurge of demand, and that was seen as a reasonably transitory thing. And you know, myself and many others were team transitory with regards to the inflation that was happening tail end of last year. That obviously has embedded, and the message now will be higher for longer with regards to inflation, largely driven by Russia, Ukraine, but other issues in play there as well. So there's a real difficult cost of living issue that is very live currently. The energy issues don't look like they're going to abate at the pace that we felt at this time last year. So that's very live and current, and we're seeing that through shifts in spend. We've data that we use in Dublin. I accept that it's Dublin and not Northern Ireland, but I think MasterCard data over the last number of weeks has shown a sharp decline in discretionary spend in Dublin, and I don't see any particular reason why that wouldn't be different in the north. So there are leading indicators that we're seeing where the discretionary spend is having to be pivoted to essential spend to cover the likes of energy costs and food costs, which are also rising. I think we sometimes have this sense that, well, during the pandemic, lots of savings were built up, and that's true. For those that were able to build savings, there was no outlet for those savings, and so there was a buffer built up, and we can see that in the stats. But what that misses is that 15% of people don't have any savings, and so we're faced with this cost of living crunch, and there's not that buffer for everyone. So there's a real concern amongst large swathes of the consumer population, and most recent consumer sentiment has taken a sharp decline. KBC Bank, Bank of Ireland, Pulse, and others are all showing that the consumer is declining in sentiment rapidly, and not just in a sort of immediacy of Russia-Ukraine fickle sense, if you like, but also in questions where they're looking forward to their spending in the next 12 months. We're seeing significant cohorts deciding to pivot their spending from the things they were going to do and maybe just hunker down a little bit. So when you consider that the consumer accounts for about 2/3 of the economic performance, and that consumer is particularly squeezed currently, then you start to think, well, that's a concern. And there's a contagion risk when the consumer pivots into just hunkering down and focusing on essential items. That impacts on the business community. Then they have a lack of ability to invest, and that then trickles through to wider parts of the economy. Now, we haven't really seen that yet in the labour market. The labour market remains strong and buoyant, and there's many in the audience, I'm sure, are struggling to recruit staff. What I would say, though, is, again, looking at most up-to-date leading type indicators, the Indeed online portal is showing that vacancy levels are tracking at higher levels than the pre-pandemic, but that's live vacancies. New vacancies posted in the last month has taken a sharp downturn as well, and that's, I suppose, an indicator that business sentiment is maybe softening. And that's a message that's carried through with the latest CBI business manufacturing sentiment, which is a 34 percentage point fall in the last month, and that's the sharpest decline since April 2020. So those are the factors that we're tracking, particularly at the minute. Very much, where is the consumer, and really looking for as real-time insights as we can get from the likes of that MasterCard spend data, personal debt type stuff. And then labour market indicators, not just the stats that come out on a monthly sort of trailing basis, but real time. What are the live vacancies? What are the new vacancies? So my sense is that when the consumer is as jittery as it is currently and as squeezed as it is, and will get more squeezed by the tax increase, the national insurance tax increase, and more inflation to come, it starts for me to point towards a sharp increase in the risk for a recession. Not quite there yet in terms of calling a recession, but I think that certainly the headwinds have built dramatically, and I wouldn't rule a recession out this year.
Thank you, and I know a number of those topics we'll pick up as we go through. One of the other things we want to ask you today was, so COVID-19 has really changed how and where we work, and even just looking at the panel and where we all are today, and looking around Belfast City Centre, it's really clear that there's been a step change. You recently collaborated with Belfast Chamber to produce a Growing Belfast report. Perhaps you can share some insights in that report and on what you found in it.
Sure. And the report was really driven by that post-pandemic, what does the city look like, and stated ambitions from the Belfast agenda to grow the population significantly, but also then as the pandemic hit and the city authorities started looking towards how does this grow? The bolder vision emerged from Belfast and recovery plans, and they all talk to a vibrant, greener, lively city centre, and that's so important for where the economy goes in terms of growth potential. And when we think about Belfast's importance for the Northern Ireland economy, it's significant. It's the population centre, it's the economic driver. There's no debate around that. And Belfast has so much going for it in terms of regeneration that has happened over the last number of years. We've seen that through hotels and office developments, but what has been so elusive in that regeneration story has been city centre living. And the ambition, if we track through the ambition to increase city centre population, we're going to fall short by about 20,000 people by 2035. So a big shortfall. And that's important because when we think about the growth that the economy in Belfast has had in terms of cybersecurity, ICT, professional services, etc., very hungry for talent, and that's increasingly difficult to find. And so part of the solution in that is attracting students, both domestic and international, and then that student population staying on through into their careers. And that's part of the jigsaw that Belfast hasn't solved yet. And there's a prize there. When we think about if you did hit that target, you get 170 million of additional spend in the local economy through pubs and clubs and culture, arts and leisure, and all the various multiplier effects that go with that. You also get as well a rates income increase, which we've calculated through could be about an extra additional 10% on Belfast's current rates base. So again, that would provide then more money in the pot for council to maintain a vibrant, accessible, safe city and improve the place. But you also get an environmental benefit from this too. You get a reduction in commuting from people outside, commuting in every day. There's about 95,000 commuters in and out pre-pandemic. And if a proportion of that comes and starts living in the city centre, you then get reductions in carbon. And when we modelled that through, it works out at about the equivalent of 200,000 trees being planted a year. And just to frame that reference, the council has an ambition to plant 1 million in the next decade. So, you can make big impact on the climate agenda through shifting where people live. So for us and Chamber, we felt it was important to really put some impetus back behind that conversation about growing the population, the city centre population, I should say, because of, there's an economic prize to be had. There's been a development that came first in terms of lots of hotel development, inward investment, building up sectors, and they need to be supported through the ability to attract staff. So I see that if it's not resolved, and there are many reasons why it mightn't be resolved in terms of infrastructure, as water and sewage and etc., and planning issues, if we don't resolve that, then we're really going to start constraining our economic growth capacity. And again, that's maybe a longer term issue, given where we are in the immediacy of Russia and Ukraine, but that's something that could really constrain our economic potential.
Brilliant, thank you, Andrew. So moving on to Gareth, and I know a number of the points Andrew just picked up on, what will come through what you're going to talk on today. I was hoping you could give us some overview of the NI labour market and how it's really changed since the onset of COVID-19 back in March 2020.
Yes, thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be back again. Before I get into the labour market, Mark, just reflecting on a couple of points that the guys made. I was sort of thinking yesterday evening, I went back to the notes that I had made in preparation for this webinar last year. And that was obviously around the first anniversary of the COVID lockdowns. And whilst we were still very much in the teeth of the pandemic, and most government support such as furlough were still in place, there was an air of optimism. The vaccine rollout program was in full swing. The labour market was holding up reasonably well. And there was a lot of optimism. The vaccine rollout program was in full swing. I think there was uncertainty around what would happen when furlough ended, but the fiscal response from governments had prevented economic catastrophe. And I think the expectation was that the economy would recover strongly last year in 2021, and then 2022 would be the year we would get back to some form of post-pandemic normality. And I was just sort of thinking, if the only thing that we had to be concerned about was COVID recovery, we'd probably be in a reasonable shape right now. But obviously the world has other major problems to deal with, and first and foremost, those are measured in lost lives. But there's a significant economic cost associated with it, and the guys have obviously touched on that, and we'll pick up on that. But sorry, Mark, yes, back to your labour market point. I think that, and this was, I think it was Andrew had mentioned, that the labour market has held up reasonably well. Particularly payrolled employees is at a record high. So not only has it exceeded its pre-COVID highs, but it's now back to its pre-COVID trend line. Which is very positive, and that's strong growth locally. It's actually put Northern Ireland at the top of the employee jobs growth charts across all 12 UK regions. And it's not often Northern Ireland gets to top UK regional economic tables, but I guess you take your victories where they come. I suppose as an aside, London actually is the region which has registered the smallest growth in employees across the UK, which might seem, I suppose, strange, but it is consistent with other data and experiences which show that large urban centres reliant on high levels of commuter footfall have been more impacted by the pandemic, and that's consistent globally. But anyway, sorry, employee jobs really good. It's not all good news though. The self-employed numbers are still below their pre-pandemic levels. And when we take both employee and self-employed numbers together, we're still down about 25,000 below pre-pandemic levels. So furlough was successful from an employee perspective, but the supports to the self-employed were less successful. There's also, I suppose, an interesting gender story in the labour market. Female employment levels had been on a long-term upward trajectory, and COVID has not had a significant impact on that long-term trend. Female employment fell by about 10,000 after the pandemic, but it has since recovered. But it's a different story with male employment. That has dropped significantly and still down around 25,000 on pre-pandemic levels. And that gender story then is linked to the final comment I would make on the labour market, which relates to economic inactivity. So for those of you who are not familiar with that phrase, the economically inactive, these are people who are not in employment and they're not registered as unemployed. They're 16 to 64, so they're in the working age population, and they're made up of four groups. There's the long-term sick. They're the people who have retired, so people who can retire early because their occupational pensions have allowed them to do that. You have students, and then you have those looking after the home and the family. And since the start of the pandemic, we've seen small increases in the numbers of long-term sick and a small increase in the working of those of working age who have chosen to retire. So no big story there, no big surprises there. We've seen a more significant increase in the number of students. I suppose two reasons for that really. One, we told young people to stay in the education system for longer when the pandemic hit because of uncertainty in the labour market. So if you're about to graduate, do a master's or stay on and get a higher level qualification, because we're not sure if there's going to be a job for you. That was the initial reaction. Another thing that we've seen as well in the last 2 years is very significant grade inflation. And so we have more young people now achieving higher grades, which is allowing them to progress on to university when some may have chosen to go into the labour market. So that's good in the long term, but it's reducing supply into the labour market in the short term. But I think the final point just on is probably the most significant is the number of people who are looking after the home and the family. This has fallen very significantly, and it's a very predominantly female cohort. And I think it's fallen from about 65,000 to 45,000 over 18 months. Now, that's the sort of change that you would expect to see over a decade or even a generation, not something that you would expect to see in a year or a year and a half. And it raises, I suppose, the very important issue or question about whether increased home working and new, and I suppose importantly, new employer attitudes to home working, if that has created new opportunities for women in particular, who can now combine their caring responsibilities with their work responsibilities when that may not have been possible in the past. So this working from home trend that has become established, I suppose, for me is a bit of a silver lining to the obviously the devastation and difficulties that the pandemic has caused.
Thank you for that. And picking up on some of the comments that Andrew made earlier around our future skills needs. So there's lots of comments on what Northern Ireland's future skills needs, but what do you think are the driving forces behind this, and what should we be doing as an economy to try and get those future skills to help build for those jobs that are there?
Yeah, I mean, when I think back at sort of early mid 2020, when the full impact of the pandemic became clear, I don't know anyone who thought that we would be sitting here, you know, in early mid 2022, and the biggest labour market challenge would be unfilled job vacancies. And I suppose in simple terms, Northern Ireland doesn't need more jobs; it needs more people with the right skills to fill those jobs. And I'm sure you know, many of the clients of people listening, and perhaps even many of your own firms, could recruit more people if applicants had the right skills. And for me, this is the number one economic policy challenge that the executive should be dealing with after the election. And the research that we have published recently draws out a few comments that we really do need to think about. The first is on demographics. And demographics is not on our side. In the 1980s, 90s, and noughties, over those three decades, the working age population increased by an average of 90,000 per decade. In the last decade, so from 2010 to 2020, it increased by only 15,000. And in the 2020s, it's forecast to get worse. It's only going to increase by around 3,000. So we're facing a major supply problem. And it sort of links into what Andrew was saying around the challenges that Belfast will face in trying to grow its resident population. We do have a number of people issue that we need to try to resolve. I think the second point is that high-level qualifications are now in even higher demand. During the pandemic, we saw a sharp increase in the hours worked by those with higher level qualifications, and we saw a reduction in the hours worked by those with lower level qualifications. And that's part of a long-term trend, and you know, there's a number of factors behind that. You've got a generational impact, which is basically you have older people who leave the labour market and they tend to have lower levels of formal qualifications, and you have younger people coming into the labour market and they tend to have higher levels of qualifications. So that's one driver of the change. You also have sectoral mix factors. So we've got sectors such as agriculture, for example. It tends to employ people with lower level qualifications. It's getting proportionally smaller. And then we've got sectors such as ICT, professional services. They're growing strongly and they have a much higher qualifications profile, I suppose, which over time significantly increases demand. And then there's the COVID impact. The data has shown an acceleration of the trend over the last 2 years. The pandemic economy has put a premium on higher level qualifications. And it's not clear if things will return to more normal levels when we enter post-COVID working conditions again. And then I think to go back to, and it's part of the how do we solve this problem, and there's this notion that Northern Ireland has a brain drain. And the narrative runs is that, too many of our young people leave Northern Ireland to go to university and don't come back. And the numbers don't quite support that, story, where over 70%, about 72% of Northern Ireland born young people who go on to study a degree do so in Northern Ireland. Now that's the second highest retention rate across all 12 UK regions. The highest is Scotland. Now that makes sense because there's no tuition fees for Scottish students in Scotland. You need a really good reason to study elsewhere. Northern Ireland, tuition fees are around half the level of England and Wales, which goes certainly some of the way to explain the relatively high retention rate that we have. But even after graduation, it's the same story. 80% of Northern Ireland born graduates, so irrespective of whether they studied here in Northern Ireland or across the water or wherever, 80% of Northern Ireland born graduates are working in Northern Ireland 15 months after they've graduated. Again, that's the second highest retention rate across all 12 UK regions. And we have to recognise Northern Ireland is a small place. So it's reasonable for our young people to want to experience living and studying somewhere else. And it does not have a retention issue, but it does have a massive inflow issue. Only 6% of students studying in Northern Ireland universities are from other parts of the UK. That is by far the smallest proportion across all UK regions. And as a result of that poor inflow, we have got a net outflow problem. And what we need to do is we need to make Northern Ireland a much more attractive place for young people to want to come here to live and to study. And as Andrew said, in the longer term, then want to make this a place to live for the rest of their lives, and they want to work here. These are problems that we should be able to solve, but it's a societal solution that is required as a whole, and we work together, because no one organisation or no one sector is going to be able to solve this on its own. So it's about how do we go about making Northern Ireland an attractive place for people who don't live here and have never been here to want to come here.
Thank you very much, Gareth. So just a reminder, everyone, there is a question and answer facility within the chat, so please do put those in. I'm going to pose some questions to our panelists today, and I'm going to start with Conor and then move to Andrew, because Gareth's already answered my first question in what he said. So we go to the polls this time next week, on the assumption that we get some politicians to form an executive. Be keen to hear your thoughts on what you think the top priority of our next executive and economy minister should be. Gareth's already outlined his, so maybe Conor, if you kick us off with that.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Mark. And actually, mine's going to link in a little bit with what Gareth spoke about, and people who have heard me speak before will probably have heard some of this previously. But I think one of the big challenges that we've had in Northern Ireland over a number of decades has been low productivity levels. So if we look over the last couple of decades, the average, whenever I talk productivity, I'm sort of output per hour. So this is effectively how much output and activity somebody produces in work during an hour of their working day. And over the last 20 or so years, average output per hour in Northern Ireland has been just below 20% lower than the wider UK average. Now, in the years since the financial crisis, the UK, from a productivity perspective, compared to other G7 advanced economies, has been a pretty poor performer. So when it comes to productivity in Northern Ireland, we are a poor performer measured against another poor performer. So it's quite a negative story for us. The reason productivity matters is it's a key driver of living standards over the longer term, and it's a key driver of economic growth over the longer term. And it's not an easy thing, nor something that can quickly be changed. So the textbook and what economic theory tells us we should do to try and drive productivity higher is to focus on a few areas, one of which is skills. And I think Gareth spoke very well about the skills challenges that we have to address here locally. So skills is certainly one. Infrastructure is another, both in terms of hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, digital infrastructure, effectively making it easier and more open for people to connect to the jobs that they want to work in and are best equipped to work in. And it remains to be seen how the impacts of the pandemic and the ability to work remotely have an impact on that particular area. There's also a bit around innovation and R&D, so encouraging businesses to invest more in innovation and on new technologies and on trying to drive efficiencies and effectiveness within their business. And another one that I often think about is about competing in global markets. So, you know, if we're encouraging export activity in Northern Ireland, then all of a sudden for local businesses, your competition is no longer just the firms in the towns and cities around you in Northern Ireland, but you're having to compete with the best businesses all over the world, and that forces you to raise your game in terms of your own effectiveness, efficiency, and the productivity of employees. So I think for me, it's very much looking across the skills, infrastructure, encouraging innovation and R&D, and promoting further exports with a goal of driving up productivity in Northern Ireland after decades of underperformance. So I think that would be a key priority for me.
Thank you, Conor. Andrew, do you have some views on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue against any of those issues that have been mentioned by Gareth or Conor. You're easy to agree with them, in fact, as priorities. But I suppose for me, and this is something that I've written about previously in terms of how I felt city deals were focused on the shiny boxes and the innovations, and really was that going to make a difference to enough people's lives? So if I was an incoming minister and thinking about a priority, I would focus my attentions on probably a couple of areas, but housing distress and housing provision in Northern Ireland is shockingly bad. You know, there's tens of thousands of people in housing distress, and a social housing sector that's, you know, proud to deliver 1,900 houses a year, when that's frankly pathetic. Tied to that then is health benefits, and that drives into then economic performance, and that drives a better, you know, a better economy. But linked, I suppose, to housing distress and improving housing would be that infrastructure piece. You know, we don't have the sewage and drainage infrastructure or the electricity grid to deliver the number of new houses that we need currently. So there are big challenges around infrastructure, which again drive right through to the heart of all our economic activity. And then increasingly urgent, and one that I think it's almost taken as for granted as an issue, so it doesn't maybe get as much from attention from economists, is the climate emergency. You know, City Council have declared an emergency. There were 2 climate bills moving through the Assembly before it broke for the election. One of them emerged victorious, and we're brilliant at strategies and we're brilliant at policies in Northern Ireland, but the next mandate has to start shifting towards delivery and actually doing something about some of these issues. And so I think, you know, I know I've taken a liberty there with not just one priority, but a few, but I think those would be where I would focus my efforts if I was a minister.
And then one of your priorities predictably goes on to the question we get first every year, and it always goes to Conor. So the housing market has been crazy over the last year. We talked about house prices the last 2 years, but there's been, you know, we have seen interest rates move since we last met. How do you see, I suppose, both of those elements panning out over the next year, and what is, I suppose, we think the response going to be?
Yeah, look, you're right. That's the question we get every year. And so, look, I'm going to start actually with the interest rate part of your question there, because I actually think this is a really interesting one at the minute for economists. We've seen a couple of Bank of England increases already. The current bank rate is at 0.75%, and that's in response to the higher inflation. But with inflation at 30-year highs, interest rates are effectively still pretty low by historical standards if we think of the sort of 4, 5, 6% that we would have seen of interest rates before the financial crisis. And so I think it's maybe worth a bit of discussion around why interest rates are still a bit lower and what's effectively making interest rate decisions a bit more complicated at the minute, because, you know, one may think with inflation at the rate it is that the answer is just to put interest rates up and hike them very quickly. I think what's making it complicated for the Bank of England is that a large part, perhaps not all, but a large part of the higher inflation that we're seeing is coming from effectively external and supply side factors. So as we went through the latter part of 2021, when inflation did start to pick up, it was mainly put down to supply and demand mismatches as the global economy began to recover from the pandemic, and the demand maybe came back a bit quicker than the supply. As for example, as has been mentioned, some people had built up savings, so demand for consumers for goods and services was able to build up a bit more quickly than businesses were able to produce and get goods to market. We've then seen fuel and energy rises as well coming through. Again, that was partly pandemic driven and then also impacted by the war in Ukraine. But as we'll all be aware, putting up interest rates is not going to change the price of a barrel of oil or a unit of gas, nor is it going to correct in the short-term supply chain disruption. But what it is doing is having that squeeze on consumer spending power. And if we think effectively, what is an interest rate rise designed to do? It's designed to reduce demand in the economy, to encourage people to save and not to spend as much, and perhaps on those discretionary incomes of those discretionary areas where people spend. And we may see some of that anyway because of the amount of inflation that we're seeing in areas which are effectively necessities, food and energy. So as people prioritize their spending in those, might we see less spending on other consumer goods and more luxury goods and services and discretionary items, which would start to reduce demand in the economy anyway. So the Bank of England are having to tread a very fine line between not letting inflation become entrenched over the longer term and reinforcing their message to firms, to consumers, to financial markets that they will keep inflation under control, trying to judge what the right change to monetary policy is to both address inflation, but also let some of those other factors play into the demand in the economy. But also not to choke off economic activity so much by increasing interest rates that we might see the economic activity start to fall and us move into a recession. So it's a really difficult balancing act. My expectation is that we'll probably see one or two more rises in interest rates this year. I think the Bank of England will take a few more steps in response to the higher inflation. And so I think we'll probably finish the year with bank rate around 1 or 1.25%. So as I say, one or two more rises from where we are. But I know there's considerable uncertainty around that, and we may see more depending on inflation dynamics. But that's what's making it difficult, I think, for the Bank of England at the minute. From a housing market perspective, look, every time I get asked this, I think back to the demand and supply fundamentals of the housing market. If we look at the demand side, what are we seeing? Well, real wage growth is one thing, which is an important driver of the housing market. Obviously, we're seeing a squeeze there with the inflation. We're seeing interest rates going up, might lead people to reduce their demand for housing somewhat. We're seeing uncertainty in the wider economy. I think we're probably still seeing some of those factors around people's need for space and outdoor space and studies, etc. There's probably still a bit of that there, but I suspect a lot of the people who were transacting on that basis may have already done so over the last couple of years. And on the supply side, certainly anecdotal and survey evidence that we're seeing would suggest there is still supply shortages, and that's before you even get into the longer term supply shortages in the actual housing stock in Northern Ireland. Putting all that together, what do I think is likely to happen? We'll probably see a bit of a slowdown in the housing market after the very strong couple of years that we've had. I don't see a big house price correction coming at this point. I think that's effectively what we probably all said a year ago as well, and that's what we've seen. So I don't think there's big house price falls coming, but I would expect that those very high rates of house price growth that we've seen over the last number of months and quarters may start to moderate somewhat back towards more normal levels, maybe a little bit lower for a while, but a bit of reversion to trend over a period of time. But again, it's as I think if we probably look back at the recordings from these webinars over the last few years, I don't think any of us would have said what has actually panned out in the housing market from the early stages of the pandemic and even last year. So there are wider factors rather than just economic ones which seem to be affecting house prices at the minute, and we'll see how that pans out over the rest of this year.
Thank you. And I know, Gareth, you look at some of this within the Policy Centre in Ulster University, but also that impact on how people are remote working, hybrid working, and how I suppose that drives into what Conor mentioned. Do you have any thoughts on how on a longer term view we might consider things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just on the interest rate point, I agree with the comments that Conor made. I think it's interesting at a more global level. You have the US, the Federal Reserve is taking a very hawkish approach. You have the European Central Bank, a much more dovish approach, and it's still talking about raising interest rates, and the Bank of England found itself somewhere in the middle. And I think central bankers in general have been stung by the criticism that they bought into the whole transitory line for too long, and they find themselves behind the curve in trying to deal with inflation. And they now run the risk of finally starting to tighten interest rates as the economy starts to slow, and creating a recession that they've been trying so hard for so long to avoid. And Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, has talked about treading this fine line between dealing with inflation on the one hand and needing to avoid pushing the economy into recession in the other. There is also a bigger, longer term picture about the need to normalize interest rates. Interest rates are still at ultra low levels, and central bankers and Monetary Policy Committee, when interest rates are very low, have limited firepower to deal with the next recession. So you need to have higher interest rates so you can reduce them to deal with the next recession. So they're trying to overcome that problem, and they haven't been able to achieve that since the financial crisis. So there's a lot of things going on in the monetary policy space. But I agree with Conor. I think there's a couple more interest rate rises coming, but no more than that. I think the market has priced in higher interest rates than it's going to play out, simply because the economy, the economic numbers are probably going to be less positive moving forward. In terms of the working from home research that we did, I suppose there are a number of interesting points. One, and I'd mentioned it in my opening comments around, it does seem to be opening up opportunities, particularly for women, to balance their and anyone, but to balance both caring responsibilities with work responsibilities, and I think that's a real positive. People in the new working environment, there does seem to be people want to get back to the office, but in a hybrid basis. There's very very small numbers of people who have the option, who want to return to the office on a full-time basis. When we did the survey, most people were still working at home almost all the time, the people that we did survey. And one of the things that I'm always conscious of as an economist, and we see it play out, is whenever people are responding, there's what they say they're going to do, and then there's how they actually respond and how they behave. And so at the minute, people are talking about wanting to get back into the office, 3 or 4 days a week. Whenever they do, the problem, I think, is that it's going to be the same 3 or 4 days a week for everyone. So it's going to be sort of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and all the commuting problems that people had pre-COVID are going to be the same commuting problems that are going to be experienced again. And I just wonder if, a month into commuting on the M1 and being stuck in some traffic jam on the M1, people will start to change their views again. So towards the end of this year, we want to do some more work just to see, basically, is hybrid working, and to try to understand that in a better way. From an employer point of view, we found that the employers were behind the employees. They were being driven by their staff in many respects, where staff were still keen to work at home at least some of the time. Employers initially wanted to get everyone back. They had these nice new shiny offices, and they were paying a lot of money for it, so they wanted to make sure their staff were using it. But employers have they've shifted their position to recognizing that a hybrid model was going to be the preferred model. And if they didn't offer their staff hybrid working options, then their staff were going to leave, go to a competitor who was going to offer them hybrid working conditions. So the primary driver from an employer perspective to adopt remote working and hybrid working was a staff retention dynamic that was driving their behavior. As I say, we're still trying to understand properly what a new normal will look like, and how will people behave, and what are the longer term implications that that's going to have for urban centres. Because if people are only going to come into Belfast city centre half as often as they did, what does that mean for cafes, restaurants, retail outlets in those urban centres?
That's great. So we've all kind of touched on, I suppose, what the impact of the war in Ukraine and is at the minute. Does anyone want to give a bit of an overview of how they see that developing over the next number of months, and what are the challenges we will see as we go through? And I don't know, Andrew, you have any insight from some of the clients you speak to on that?
I suppose it's so determined by how long it lasts and how long it takes to resolve. So the immediate shocks were supply chain shocks and sharp increases in commodity prices. We think about what Russia, Ukraine give to the rest of the world in terms of weight and gas and fuels and metals, in fact. So we've seen clients in car sales, for example, struggling to having previously struggled to get order and fulfillment dates due to microchip shortages, now struggling to get those orders fulfilled due to the various metals that go into catalytic converters, for example, which come from Russia, Ukraine. So it's just a litany of supply chain challenges that have faced that sector and other manufacturing sectors. So I suppose the longer that the issues there go on, the more that becomes a negative headwind on performance. And then as well, just energy costs being a major issue, and I suppose that ties into, I think, how potentially the office versus home working will go when your gas bill lands. There'd be a significant motivator there to go back to the office, I would suggest. Says the guy in his office today. So I think there's lots of different behavioural impacts at play there too. I think as well, just the Russia-Ukraine issue and how that pans out. It probably, I think, is tipping the economy into that greater risk of recession, which should, I think, reduce that. I heard Conor talk about the difficult challenge that the Bank of England faces, and I think the trajectory at the minute is that there will be a couple more increases in interest rates over this year. The wisdom of that, I would challenge. I know interest rates are very accommodative at the minute, but the number of people that are facing a shift into poverty, I mentioned at the start of my remarks about 15% of people without savings, and then these various cost of living increases through energy costs and food costs. So there's not that buffer there in the economy. So there's a lot of challenge there, and we've got the national insurance increase as well. On top of that, we've got the removal of the universal credit £20 piece as well. So lots of constraining factors, and then to add interest rate increases in on top of that, I think just starts to compound that. And I would say that unemployment is a lot more painful than inflation. And I think the balance for me would be that interest rate rises should cease until we see how we get through the next 6 months or so and see how the economy goes.
One thing I'd say, Mark, just in terms of how the Ukraine-Russia situation plays out, my sense is that unfortunately this, I think, will turn into a longer-term attritional war that over time will just it will continue, but it'll just feature less and less on the headlines. And I think the outworkings of that from a global economic point of view is for Western whether it's Western Europe, North America, developed countries, or perhaps even the rest of the world, moving away from its reliance on Russian energy. And the short-term answer to that is to try to get other oil producers, particularly members of OPEC, to increase their supply. I think they've been quite reluctant to do that. So I think there's still scope for current oil producers and energy producers to increase supply. And that may bring some alleviation to energy markets towards the end of this year. And then I think that the longer term answer is we're obviously increasing investments in renewable energies, but that is an answer that we don't get until the end of this decade. There's also, we're seeing increased investment in UK oil and gas in the North Sea, but that's again not a short term. There's no short-term answers from that response. So I think that it's not a good news story if you live in Ukraine. I don't see this war ending anytime soon. Russia may be forced to reduce the scale of it, so it becomes a war in the eastern part of Ukraine. But I think our only potential savior in the short term is that we get OPEC, other OPEC nations, and oil producers to increase supply as much as possible to alleviate price pressures in the energy markets.
Thank you. So as we wrap up here, we're coming up to the half hour. Can you just get a final comment and takeaway from each of you for the economy for the next 12 months? And we've come through the whole webinar without mentioning Brexit, which just shows you the changes that we've had over the past year. But maybe come to you, Conor, first, just your key takeaway for next year.
Yeah, so I think I'd almost go back to some of the remarks I made at the very beginning, which is as we look at the economy this year, I do think in annual terms this year we will still see growth in the Northern Ireland economy. As I've mentioned, it's important to note there is still an element of bounce back coming in there. So we shouldn't view 3.6% growth, which outside of the pandemic times would have been one of the strongest rates of growth we would have had in a very long time, with complete optimism. But we can at least draw some from the fact that the economy is we're hopeful that the economy will grow again this year. But the economic environment is very uncertain. We have the war in Ukraine. We still have COVID. We haven't talked a lot about Brexit today, but it is still a factor at play there. We have this inflation, which is really impacting consumers. Any one of these things on their own would be challenging in terms of both economic forecasting and the wider performance of the economy. Combining all of them together is really very difficult. So look, I think there's probably more risks to the economy than upside potential at this stage, but hopefully as we go through this year, we will still see economic expansion.
Andrew, closing remarks?
I suppose I've come today to be probably a little bit more pessimistic than I certainly was even a month ago. I think when Grant Thornton does a global survey of business sentiment, and it was the second half of last year when we did that fieldwork, and optimism across Ireland was significantly higher about the year ahead. That has ebbed away. We see that ebbing away in business sentiment, and we see it ebbing away quite dramatically in consumer sentiment. So those headwinds have built, and we have a government who are seeking ways to not spend any more money to address this cost of living crisis. Yesterday they announced that they might suspend MOTs. That's what they've come up with as one of their plans for the cost of living crisis. I think when we have a government hell-bent on trying not to spend more money to solve the worst dent to the cost of living since the 50s, then we're in pretty negative territory now. I think there are some tailwinds, and the labour market has been very robust, and I suppose that would be a glimmer of hope that the vacancies that are out there sustain and that we can start to fill some of those, and that the labour market remains robust. But it's a labour market where a number of people are increasingly under pressure to meet their monthly bills, which means they're pivoting to essential items and away from discretionary. So again, there's lots of challenges on the horizon, and I just hope that there's a way to pick through it.
Thank you, Andrew. Gareth?
Yeah, I'll suppose finish off just with a couple of comments. Obviously we have an election coming up here next month, and I'm reasonably optimistic. I'm more optimistic than most that we're going to get a new executive formed when the results are in. It may not be formed immediately, but I think that the pressure on the local parties to form an executive to deal with the challenges that they face will be too great. So I'm confident that a new executive will be formed. If a new executive is formed, there is increasing speculation. Obviously, we don't know this, but there's increasing speculation that the economy portfolio could move to a different minister. In its different guises, it's always sat with a DUP minister. I think there's a much increased chance that Sinn Féin might take that economy brief, and if that happens, we could see a change in emphasis in terms of where the Department for the Economy and its various NDPBs seeks to invest money. It's obviously under pressure in terms of reduced funding because of lack of EU funds, but I think that we might see a pivot away from the levels of investment that we've seen in businesses before towards an increased pivot to investment in people before and investment in skills before. And that's what businesses need right now. They need people with the right skills. So I may be a little bit more try and on some sort of an optimistic note. I'm reasonably optimistic that we will see an executive formed later this year, and I do think that they will be sufficiently incentivized to start addressing some of the challenges, some of the issues that we face.
Thank you for that optimistic note to finish on, Gareth, and thank you to all our contributors today, to Gareth, Andrew, and Conor. It's been great to hear your views today, and thank you to all the questions that have come through. Have a great day, everyone, and hopefully see you soon.